Well, there's an old joke that says that UCC, which we would normally think of as United Church of Christ, actually stands for Unitarians considering Christ or Christianity. Um, I got a chuckle out of that a long time ago, but it became even more real when somebody told me that some years back, Pilgrim actually was looking to maybe get into a merger with the local Unitarian church. And I guess the thing that finally did kill it was that the Unitarians are quite upfront, they're quite honest that they are not a Christian church in any way, shape, or form. They respect Jesus, but that's not who they are. And there was at least enough within Pilgrim to say, that might be a deal breaker for us. So remained in the UCC, which I'm also told has been said is to stand for unbelievably confused Christians. That's also amusing to a certain extent, as long as it doesn't get pushed too far. But the issue that is, I think, lies behind it is, well, how do we reflect and how do we interact and how do we understand other religions? And that's an issue. And there are a variety of different responses. That one response says, well, you know, all those people, if they don't convert at some point in time, they're going to go to hell. Another point says, well, no, that's not true. Another way of looking at it says, well, no, all religions are basically the same. So therefore, it doesn't really matter which one you take. And there's a school of thought with which I think we're familiar that just tries to blend all the religions. They'll have a little Christianity here, a little Buddhism there, maybe a little Islam over there, a tinge of Hinduism, maybe throw in a pinch of paganism for good measure, a little Taoism, and just stir it up and serve it out. And that's kind of interesting, I think. My personal view on it is that I think that the last one is just intellectually indefensible. And I also think it's an insult to the various religions. When you say that, well, they're all saying the same, that's kind of like telling maybe a fan of the University of Michigan, well, all universities are the same, all football teams are the same. You guys are no different from the Ohio State Buckeyes. Imagine how well that would go. Only we're talking here about something a little bit more serious, at least I hope you would agree with me, than football. And so I think it's a mistake to try and say that they all say the same thing. I think it's entirely possible to become better acquainted with the beliefs of others, to respect them, to learn what we can from them, but not to try and say that they're all the same or trying to blend them together, because in point of fact, they don't say the same thing. They have very different views and very different understandings of reality as a whole. And as C.S. Lewis began his second section, which was a little bit, the first one was about morality. And he said that, okay, we have that instinct that there are certain things we should do and certain things we should not do. And yet we don't keep up to those things. Whereas in our desire for hunger means we go get something to eat. And other desires we have, we'll go do those. But in terms of that idea of morality, it's something that we affirm, but we do not always uphold it. And not only that, but we insist that certain moralities and certain ethical standards are better than others. And so Lewis raised the question, well, if there's nothing really behind those, if that's just culture, if that's just the way your brain works, then how can you ever really say that one ethic is better than another? You really can't. So that was his first point. And now he's going to begin to turn and deal with the issue of religion. And I want to begin with a quote of his. He says, people who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. Or you might say the view of ultimate reality, because actually not all religions believe in a God. There are two very different ideas on this subject. One of them is the idea that God is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, this is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man, but you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer, or she. It all depends on our point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God is beyond good and evil, is called Pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel, and as far as I can understand, by the Hindus, and he's correct, also Buddhists. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, or we would say Islam, or Muslims, and Christians. And so what he's trying to say here is that you've got initially this basic division between this thought that says basically that which we call the divine is simply some animating spiritual principle behind all it is, and that everything participates in it. So healthy cells and cancer cells, that's all part of this one thing, or that is animating us all. And it also says that there's really no serious distinction, that we're all in permanent kind of illusions to one another. That, okay, right now we might think that we're individuals, but we're going to die and we won't be individuals anymore. We'll all simply either dissipate into a divine nothingness in Buddhism or into an allness in Hinduism. And this has some practical outworkings, because if you say that just what is, and that everything is good in one way and bad in another, then you have to ask yourself, how well does that actually apply to real life? And as we get into some of these things, I'd like us to think about some of the people that we've lost this past year in 2020. We lost 5 members of our congregation that were all very dear to us. So according to this way of thinking, you can't really say that the diseases that took their lives are bad, that, you know, whatever it was, be it COVID or heart failure or cancer or Alzheimer's, they aren't really bad things, that they're just things that we, from our perspective, call bad, but they're not really bad. And C.S. Lewis also has a little view when he gets with that. And he basically says, confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian or the Muslim or the Jew replies, don't talk damn nonsense. For Christianity and the others are fighting religions. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of his head as a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong, and that the world that God made and that God insists very loudly, is to be putting them right again. And so he's trying to say, look, if you want to say that something is wrong, if something is evil, then you can't go with a pantheistic view. And that is one of the things that I think is deficient about the Buddhist and the Hindu view, and also others that hold that. And it's not a question of, you know, they're evil for holding that, but it's also not a question of that this is just some philosophical speculation. It has real impact, because if you go with that route, then if you're going to be intellectually consistent, and we want to be a thinking church for progressive people or progressive church for thinking people, if you want to think it through, then you have to say, given that viewpoint, then these losses were not really bad. That there was nothing wrong with the COVID that's killed 400 some thousand Americans and far more worldwide. It's not inherently bad at all. There's nothing wrong with the cancer that took Ray or Marsan's life. Nothing wrong with that at all. That's just something that nobody really lives out of. When we lose somebody, we don't just go, oh, well, that's just one of those things. We realize that, no, this is something that should not be. And when people get to the point where they can say that everything is good or bad, then you've undercut morality entirely. You can't argue, that the Dalai Lama does, that somehow Tibet should be free with the view that he holds. That you can't say that, because ultimately all of these things are just impermanent. And in one way, maybe that's bad. In another way, maybe it's good. So we're talking about having some intellectual integrity here. And does your particular understanding of the divine, or the lack of the divine, does it actually support the way you think and the way you act? And that's what Lewis is trying to say, is that, look, if you go that pantheist route, you have no basis for saying that something is just or unjust. But if you go the route that the Western religions have tended to go, that there is a personal God who is good and who says, okay, some things are good, some things are bad, and those bad things need to be corrected. Then you can say that, okay, justice matters, that treating people honestly and fairly, that matters, that has eternal consequence. You can say that cancer or COVID or Alzheimer's, that these are bad things, that they need to be fought against, that they should be tried to be eliminated because they are destructive, they are evil. And that is one of the first things that comes when you start to say, what do religions actually teach? What actually lies behind them? How does that viewpoint, how does that support the way that you actually live or that they actually live? And if somebody says that they think such and such, but the way that they live says, no, you don't, then there is I don't want to call it hypocrisy, but there's a mental disconnect that needs to be looked at. So that's the first thing, is that the religions are different. They teach different things. They have different understandings of reality. And in particular, you can see that in the difference between Eastern and Western religion, between religions that see things as being basically all one, it's known as monism, and those that see things as being distinct from each other. So again, if you want to put that into practical aspect, are Fred and Ray and Marsan and all those folks, are they simply gone forever as individuals? Or does their individual existence carry on? Put in very practical terms, will we see them again or not? And if you're going to go that Eastern route, then the answer is no, you will never see them again. And when we pass away, nobody will ever see us again either. We simply melt away either into nothingness or into an allness, but our individual existence is over. It was always only temporary and nothing more. And that, it doesn't matter how well you lived or how badly you lived, eventually that's what's going to happen, though usually in Eastern thought there's this concept of karma, so that you'll continue to come back until you get it right. But the question is, well, what actually is right? So there are some problems there. So that's the first question that is asked, is simply, what do all these religions, what do they say? And does it actually back the way that you live? Now, the second question that Lewis deals with has to do with, okay, well, if you're talking about a just God who desires life to be led one way and not another way, then you have to ask, well, why is there evil? Why is there injustice in the world? And he says that when he was an atheist, he always said, well, your attempts to explain this are all very nice, but why don't you just admit that the easiest explanation is there is nobody there. There is no God. And so that's why the world is cruel and unjust. But then he recognizes, well, wait a minute. If there's nothing there, then why am I talking about injustice? Why am I talking about cruelty? Because these things suggest that you know something else, that things should be another way. The analogy says is that if you lived in a world in which there was no light and which people had no eyes, you'd never talk about darkness or light, because those wouldn't be terms that you would have any meaning to you at all. And yet we live in a world that is not always just, and yet we claim it needs to be made just. So he recognized, okay, the atheist position, and he called it lazy, it just doesn't work. But where does evil come from? And there are a variety of different explanations, and I hesitate to go with any one of them. I mean, I think when somebody says, I have absolutely the answer as to why, God is good and all powerful, and yet there's suffering in the world. But I think the road that he goes down is probably the best. And he talks simply about freedom. And along with that freedom, he also talks about the notion of God being opposed by an evil personality, which we would refer to variously as Satan, Lucifer, the devil, or whatnot. And he brings up the issue of, isn't that kind of silly to talk about a devil in this day and age, and with the horns and the tail? And he rightly says about appearances, I don't think that's really the issue. But he does go on to say that actually it makes a good deal of sense if you connect that with freedom. So the Christian understanding of the devil, or of Satan, is that God has created all sorts of beings and given them free will. And he uses the analogy in terms of, if you give people free will, that is your will, but that doesn't necessarily mean, as a matter of fact, almost guarantees, that in other things your will not be done. If you tell your kids, look, I want you to pick up your room, but I'm not going to do it for you. I'm not going to force you. I want you to do that freely. There's a really good chance that your kids will not pick up the room. So that's not your will, but you gave them the freedom to do that because you believe that there's something about making free choices that is worth all of the negatives that come with it. That you don't want robots. You want people and beings that have the freedom to choose this and not the other. And indeed, it's sometimes kind of hard to talk about somebody, being good if they had no chance to do evil. That's a philosophical thing we don't need to get into a lot. But the idea is that God desires people to have free will, and God wants people to respond in freedom, and not everybody does. And the point that Christianity makes is that human beings aren't the only things that God has created, that God has created other beings, that these beings have great intellect and great power, and they also have been given freedom. And when they use their freedom in a negative way, the impact is even worse. Example he uses that a cow really can't be very good or very bad. It just doesn't have much choice, much freedom. A dog has the potential to be a little better or a little worse. They are more intelligent animals. And then he says a child, even more so. A regular human being, again, greater power to do good, but also greater power to do evil. And if you get to a genius, we all talk about an evil genius. Well, that same genius that could be used to do great good, if it goes the other way, will do great harm. It's worth noting that Lewis, of course, is writing in the aftermath and against the backdrop of Nazi Germany. Well, what made Nazi Germany so horribly deadly? It's because it wasn't some backwards nation, some primitive nation. It was one that had a lot of technology, a lot of scientists, so a lot of people that could strategize and do all sorts of things. And so it became a very, very serious and horrible threat to humanity in general. So it's this idea of freedom that Lewis says lies behind why do we have that desire for good? Why would God demand and desire a good, and yet there's evil? And it's because God has given people freedom, and if they use freedom for good, then good things happen. If they use their freedom to do evil, bad things happen. And not only humans, but others that we might call angelic beings, they also have freedom. And because they have greater power and greater intelligence, when they go bad, they go seriously bad. So ultimately, the Christian faith says that behind all the evil in the world, there is a being that call him Satan, Lucifer, devil, whatever you want to call, but there is a being that is malevolent, that desires our destruction, that hates everything that God has made, that is in rebellion. And when people follow that, when they become destructive, they too are becoming rebellious. So it's about freedom. And then the last thing we want to cover today is, well, what is God's response to this? And Lewis says, well, to begin with, God has given us a conscience. So we can know that there is such a thing as good and evil, and we can work with that, and we can become better or we can become worse. But we also know that we're going to do some things that we shouldn't have done. Second thing is that there are myths or stories in all sorts of cultures about someone who dies and rises, or that gives their life sacrificially for the benefit of others. And then the third thing he says is that, well, and then God has took people from the Middle East, the Jewish people, and spent about the better part of 2,000 years trying to get through to them. This is what I'm like. This is, I am one. There are not a bunch of me. That I have certain things that I hold to be sacred that you should do, other things you shouldn't be doing. And then lastly, and most mysteriously of all, Lewis says, well, then God sent Jesus. And this is the big question about what's so particular about Jesus. And here's the last thing, and the kind of a famous quote that Lewis says. He says that if you look at Jesus and you actually listen to the things that he said, then what you cannot say is that he was just a good moral teacher, because in particular, he claimed to be able to forgive sins. And Lewis rightly says, okay, it's one thing if you do something hurtful to me, I can forgive you for, stealing my wallet or, kicking me in the shins. I can do those things. But if I were to say, well, I forgive you for stealing, say, Terry's wallet or kicking Terry in the shins, then there's something kind of sounds wrong with that. I think Terry would be going, wait a minute, Dave, you cannot forgive others for doing that to me. Only I can do that. And yet Jesus was saying, no, I forgive you for hurting other people. And what he was claiming there was the authority that only belongs to God. So you have to say that Jesus was either nuts, that he was just delusional, or that he was truly twisted and evil. But you can't actually see what Jesus taught and then say, well, he was just a good teacher. And Lewis famously says that this is not an option that Jesus leaves us, and he didn't intend to. That we're ultimately we're forced to choose, okay, was this guy actually legitimate in saying, your sins are forgiven and other things? Or was he nuts? Or was he just trying to mess with people's heads? Was he a megalomaniac? Those are the three choices. And that is tough for many people to buy into. And so some folks try to say, well, Jesus didn't really teach this. But if you look at the Gospels and use any kind of normal historical method as opposed to theological, again, for those of you that haven't heard my talk on this, theologians are not good historians by and large. They deal with whatever the ideology says and try to read it back into time. They don't use their sources very well, unfortunately. But a historian will look at the Gospels and they would notice that, no, actually, this is indeed what Jesus taught. Some of the things you could say, yeah, were read back. But when it comes to forgiveness, that wasn't read back. That's something that Jesus claimed to be able to do. It's right there from the beginning. He also dealt with the idea that there was a demonic force. Matter of fact, in Mark's Gospel, which is the oldest of the Gospels, the very first unusual thing that Jesus does is perform an exorcism. He throws a demon out of a fellow that's in a synagogue. It's the very first thing. And because we're so uncomfortable or so unused to the idea of there being a demonic realm, even a godly realm sometimes, we just look at that and goes, oh, that's ancient nonsense. But I don't think it is. I've actually seen not simply the Yad Vashem Holocaust memorial photographs. One time I had a parishioner who had been in World War II, and one of his unit was actually one of the ones that liberated one of the death camps. He had a Polaroid camera with him, and he took pictures of what was left of the bodies of the Nazis he killed, and he showed them to me. And after looking at those things, I have no difficulty believing in something demonic, because that kind of evil goes far beyond. I mean, humans can do some awful things, but Hitler needed help. And it's sobering that we tend to joke about the devil, but that's not something to be joked about. If you're going to talk Satan, you're going to talk the Holocaust, you're going to talk the killing fields, you're going to talk Rwanda, you're talking serious evil, mass murder, cruelty, sickness, disease. You're talking about a being that wants to destroy everything that God is about, everything that we're about. And so Jesus came to deliver us from that. And he began by saying, you need forgiveness for the times that you have done wrong, for the times that you have wittingly or unwittingly joined in those forces that are anti-God, that seek to rebel. And I am here to forgive you, to forgive all of you, and also to overcome and to defeat the devil. And the way that Jesus does that is not by a conquering army, but strangely enough, by yielding himself to all the powers of evil. And so the one who is without sin takes the brunt of human sin amplified, that he is betrayed, he is cruelly whipped and beaten, he is humiliated, and he dies a long, slow, agonizing death. So that's Lewis's introduction to the Christian faith. And he's basically saying, take a look at these claims, understand what you can logically say about them or not say about them, and then decide, okay, was Jesus just delusional? Was he a megalomaniac? Or was he actually the Messiah, God, or someone that acted with the full authority of God in a unique way? And when you go down that route, you recognize that that doesn't play well with others in terms of, is this true or is this not true? So what Lewis is trying to do is to get people to think and to ask, what is it that I believe? And if I think it through, does it make sense? Does it do justice to the way the world is? Does it allow me to say that slavery is evil? Does it allow me to say that fascism is evil? That Stalin and Hitler and others, that they were evil, that things should be better than they are and have been? Does it give me a solid intellectual basis for saying these things? And what is that basis? And then it says, okay, why do we have those things? Is there something that goes beyond us? And what is the nature of that? And how are we to be delivered from that kind of evil? And is Jesus the one who actually does deliver us from that? So Christianity is not talking about morals and ethics, except to provide some context. It's saying this man, this Jesus, who lived and died in Palestine 2,000 years ago, this man was and is the incarnation of the divine, and that he came that we might all be forgiven, and he has that authority and right, and that we might be set free from the power of evil. Those are some powerful questions. They deserve thought. They deserve reflection. Let us pray.